So this presentation is to kind of teach you what it means to go down the rabbit hole. And what you're going to do as you go down the rabbit hole in your research, you're going to create a historical narrative blog. And this will kind of show you what I mean by that and what it is you're kind of doing. Okay? So going down the rabbit hole, what it really means is you need to dive into the research. And in essence, you don't really know a whole lot about your topic, but you're going to kind of follow where the research leads you. You're striving for two things. You're striving for, number one, depth. You really want to get a good, deep understanding of the information that you're researching, as well as explore a variety of topics related to it. So you don't want to follow just one path, but you really want to follow a variety of paths there. And so you don't want to explore just one option. As you read through one option, it may lead you or mention other things, and then you want to go explore those other things that it's mentioning as well, and do Google searches on those. And that would be the breadth piece of it, going in a variety of directions and topics. And then do multiple searches on a topic so you can get greater understanding of that one particular thing, and that gives you that depth. If you just read one article, that doesn't necessarily get it done. And so you need to read a couple different articles on it, and it'll help you to understand it a little bit better and provide you with additional examples and specific information, which will give you that depth that you're looking for. And then you're going to create that historical narrative to kind of go with that. So what a historical narrative, and we'll call it a blog, is, and it's very similar to a journal, where as you're going through this process and finding new information and reading about it, you're kind of documenting that along the way. And each entry in your blog or in your journal is in essence another stop on the rabbit hole. It's another piece of important information that you learned about that you think is important enough to include in your research. So another way to look at it is it's sort of like a map of your research and your thinking. So think in terms of, hey, you did some initial research and it took you in one direction, and we'll see a kind of a diagram of this here in just a second. But you log that entry and you talk about what it is you found and what you learned from that one resource. But then you realize that there was additional things that it kind of mentioned, and so you go on to explore those as well. And so the next entry might be an exploration of one of those new topics that you came across. And so as I read through your blog, I get an understanding of kind of the map or the direction that you went as you dug deeper and deeper into your research. You might also want to highlight any aha moments, and I'll point one out to you here in the next diagram, what an aha moment sort of is. But each one of these entries will contain a title, kind of the summary of what you learned or what you found from it, give me a link to that resource. But one note here is if you come across a resource, a website, or a video, or whatever it might be, and you kind of go, there's nothing new here, I don't really care about this information, then don't include it in your blog. It's not necessary to include it because it's not helpful, it's not adding anything new necessarily. Okay, so here's a diagram of what your research might look like, and it's kind of diving into that rabbit hole. So your initial search, and when I looked up environmental impacts of World War I, I kind of had a preconceived notion that I'd be looking at, after the land was bombed and things like that, like, how long it would take to recover. And there was certainly some of those short-term effects, but as I dove deeper, I started to realize that not only were there short-term effects that they had to overcome and kind of get the land back to the way it was before, but there were also long-term effects that didn't really relate to the actual fighting itself, but it actually changed and shifted patterns around the world that led to some other bigger things. And so I thought, boy, I really need to explore those as well. So I went in and looked at some of the short-term effects. I realized, hey, it destroyed farmland, and they were going to need to do some things to kind of regenerate that. There was chemically destroyed land that they had to deal with and get the poisonous chemicals out of the land in order to make the soil good again. They were diverting rivers as they were building trenches and different kinds of things that changed the landscape because the rivers weren't allowed to flow the way they normally would flow or flood the way they normally able to flood and those kinds of things. So I would go in and explore what the diverted rivers might look like more and find out more about that. I could dig a little deeper there. I'd go and look at what they'd have to do to fix the chemically destroyed land, all that kind of stuff, and what some of the greater impacts there. I didn't even realize that this would have a huge impact on animals, and that some animals would become extinct, like the European bison, as a result of this. And so I dived down a little bit deeper into that. Deforestation to build all these trenches and some of the different things they needed. And then as a result of that, you lose native species, and there was introduction of foreign species of trees and different kinds of plants introduced that would take over. So it changed the landscape that way. Changes in crop production, all kinds of things. But you can see as I would learn one thing, it would introduce other things that took me in other directions, and then I'd go research those other directions. And so this is kind of a visual representation of going down that rabbit hole that I might explore. You don't need a visual representation for yourself, but this certainly will give you an idea of the thought process in my head and some of the pathways I took as I started to research some of the stuff. None of this I knew ahead of time. It was just an initial search that I started to read, and it kind of led me in some new directions. And so I just took it from there, and it led me all down all kinds of paths. And that's really what this is all about. So ultimately, here's what your narrative blog looks like. You're going to give me a document. You'll have some kind of a title. Here's my first entry, and I've gone on to Google and I've done a search on my topic, and I started doing this initial research, and I find some information there that I like. So I'm going to write up sort of a narrative of that, and it talks about how I initially thought I was going to be looking around these things, and then I started to read this resource, and it took me in another couple of directions where there was really kind of the short-term impacts and these long-term impacts. And I said, hey, I'm going to explore both. And so I've kind of typed up what I learned from that and where I'm taking it. I'm going to make sure I include that, that link to this resource that I was using. And then I'm ready for my second entry. Do another Google search on one of the topics that I uncovered from here. I'm going to look up short-term effects on the, on the environment. And I'm going to pursue this idea of European bison being killed to extinction and what that was all about. And I found a website that talked about that. And so I explored that a little bit more deeply. And here's the website to that. And maybe I'll pursue deforestation. And if I find some things in deforestation, it talks about native plants and things like that. But I'll write about what I learned about for deforestation and some of the impacts there and how that changed the landscape. And then I'll go explore some of those other things. So my narrative blog looks like these entries. It's got the title, it's got my narrative, what I learned from it, it's got my link to the resource, and I just kind of keep a list of this, and as I read through these, I'll be able to kind of follow your train of thought and where you went with it and how you explored in your research.